Look at this photograph. A little girl with brown eyes and blonde hair stares at the camera. She's just over a year old. In 110 days, that hair will be ripped out by the roots. Her tiny body will be covered in fractures at different stages of healing, and her head will suffer a fatal blunt force trauma.
The LaGrange County woman convicted in the death of baby Alissa is back behind bars after a parole violation.
The system designed to protect children will become an accomplice to her murder. A doctor who saw her more than 10 times won't report the abuse. Social services with an active case will say everything's fine, and the woman who kills her will spend 77 days in prison. 77 days for a child's life. This is the story of Alissa Beth Guernsey. Before I continue, write in the comments what country you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel and share this video, because stories like this can't be forgotten and they must never happen again. On November 2nd, 2007, in Columbia City, Indiana, Kelly Sprunger gave birth to her third child. That same day, she was celebrating her own birthday. Fate tied mother and daughter to the same date, a symbolic connection meant to last a lifetime. Alissa Beth Guernsey came into this world as a healthy baby. Her father, Michael Guernsey, was completely devoted to his youngest daughter. Her 6-year-old sister and 3-year-old brother welcomed the baby with joy. Alissa was a calm infant. She rarely cried without reason, settled easily in someone's arms, and looked at everything around her with curiosity. By her first birthday, Alissa was already taking her first steps while holding onto furniture. She responded to her name, reached out to loved ones, and was starting to repeat simple sounds. She was a normal, healthy child who should have grown up, learned to walk, talk, and go to school. But November 2008 split the family's life into before and after. A month later, in November 2008, Michael Guernsey died in a car crash on Interstate 69 in DeKalb County. The impact was instant and fatal. 13-month-old Alissa was left without a father. For Kelly Sprunger, this death was a breaking point. The woman had a history of struggling with drug addiction and depression. For a while, she held it together, tried to be a mother to 3 children. But losing her partner was too heavy a burden. Kelly relapsed. She stopped answering calls from social services, stopped managing daily life. This wasn't evil intent. It was complete surrender to grief and the disease of addiction. The Department of Child Services already had an open case on the Sprunger family. By the end of November, it became clear that Kelly couldn't keep the children safe. When the Department of Child Services realized Kelly couldn't cope, the solution came from within the family. Kelly's cousin, 29-year-old Christy Schaffer, offered temporary help. She and her 34-year-old husband, Matt, were already raising 4 children of their own in the small town of Topeka, LaGrange County. Christy promised to take Kelly's 3 kids until she got back on her feet. On December 9th, the Steuben County Circuit Court officially placed Alissa and her siblings in the care of the Schaffer family. The department approved this decision without hesitation. In the child protection system, kinship care is considered the gold standard. The child stays with family, avoiding the trauma of being placed with strangers. In theory, it looked perfect. In practice, the Schaffer household now had 7 children. The next morning, Christy took Alissa to her first visit with pediatrician John Egley. The 13-month-old girl was calm, showing no signs of stress or fear. The doctor recorded the standard phrase in her medical chart: healthy child, development appropriate for age, normal behavior. This was the last time he would write anything like that about her. The first crack in the facade of well-being appeared quickly. 5 days later, the Schaffers failed to show up for a scheduled court hearing. Christy explained it as a migraine attack and 2 sick children. Maybe it was true, but it was also the first missed checkpoint, the first signal that something was going wrong. The reality of life in the Schaffer home was far from the picture of a happy family. Matt wasn't working, living on weekly unemployment checks and occasional child support payments. Supporting 7 children on that money was practically impossible. By early January, Christy filed an official petition to have the monthly Social Security payments for Alissa's older sister, $637, transferred to her account. In a home where money wasn't enough even for necessities, the tension grew with each passing day. In mid-January, social workers from the department made a scheduled visit. They checked all the children, talked with Christy. She confidently told them how well the children were adjusting, how Alissa had gotten used to the new home, and was even sleeping better. The workers noted in their report, children developing normally. They left, noticing nothing. After this visit, what can only be called hell began in Alissa's life. The girl who had been called healthy a month earlier started changing rapidly. Her skin grew pale, bruises appeared on her body, her blonde hair began disappearing, not falling out naturally but vanishing in clumps, torn out by the roots. Alissa stopped smiling. She became fearful, withdrawn, quiet. And Christy started taking her to the doctor regularly, again and again and again. The last week of January brought the first serious injury that could no longer be hidden. When Christy brought Alissa to Dr. Egley's office, there was a wound about half an inch long on the left side of the girl's forehead. Christy explained that the child had fallen. The doctor stitched it up and sent them home. A week later, the stitches came out. But the doctor visits didn't end there. They were just beginning. Christy called the Department of Child Services reporting the injury and immediately asked if she could claim Kelly's children as dependents on her tax return. Money was urgently needed. The tension in the house kept growing. In early February, the children were supposed to have a visit with their biological mother. Christy canceled it, claiming Alissa and her brother were sick. This was the second missed visit. The next day, workers from DCS came to check. Were the children really sick? They were all completely healthy. The lie was obvious, but no action was taken. Then came Valentine's Day. The holiday of love turned into another doctor visit. Christy brought Alissa complaining of hair loss and bruising from the slightest touch. Dr. Egley examined the 16-month-old girl and saw a picture that should have alarmed any medical professional. Rashes, scabs, and bruises covered the child's entire face. He suspected an infection and ordered blood tests. The results came back completely normal. A healthy child doesn't get bruises all over their body and massive hair loss without a serious medical reason. Logic pointed to one answer, but Dr. Egley didn't ask the obvious question. Instead, he listened to Christy's versions. First, she claimed that Alissa had fetal alcohol syndrome, that her mother hadn't received prenatal care, that the girl was born with drug addiction. But medical records from the hospital told a different story. Alissa was born a completely healthy child. The toxicology was clean. When that version didn't work, Christy switched to a new theory: leukemia. Only blood cancer could explain the hair loss, she claimed. Dr. Egley referred Alissa to a specialist, a pediatric oncologist at Riley Hospital for Children in Indianapolis. By early March, the girl's condition had deteriorated so much that hiding it became increasingly difficult. Another visit to Dr. Egley revealed an injury to her left arm, a bruise near her left eye, and new areas of baldness. Christy explained this with hyperactive dogs that supposedly knocked the child down. Dr. Egley believed it so completely that he personally called the Department of Child Services and assured them he suspected nothing unusual. 2 days later, a CT scan showed a broken arm. Alissa was brought to Riley Hospital, where she was examined by Dr. Robert Fallon, a specialist in hematology and oncology. He ran all the necessary tests, checked blood coagulation, ruled out leukemia. The results were normal again. Before Dr. Fallon sat a child with a broken arm, a history of unexplained injuries, bruises all over her body, and hair torn out. Any doctor familiar with the signs of child abuse would have seen the picture clearly. But instead of suspecting violence, Dr. Fallon offered an incredible explanation. Perhaps Alissa broke her arm while restlessly tossing and turning in her crib at night. 16-month-old children don't break bones just by rolling over in bed. But Dr. Fallon didn't want to ask uncomfortable questions. He sent Alissa back to Dr. Egley without any additional recommendations. 10 days after this visit, an event occurred that sealed the girl's fate. The Steuben County Court held a hearing on Alissa's case as a child in need of services. Kelly Sprunger, crushed by grief and addiction, admitted that her drug problems had negatively affected her ability to be a mother. The court made its decision. It would be in Alissa's best interest to remain in Christy Schaffer's care. The Child Protection System, created to save lives, had just signed a death warrant. Saturday, March 28, 2009, began like any normal morning in the Schaffer home. The children woke up early, had breakfast, played in the cramped living room. Nothing suggested that for Alissa, this would be the last day of her life. By evening, Christy decided to drive to the video rental store and pick up Happy Meals at McDonald's for the kids. She loaded Alissa, her older sister, and several other children into the car. The trip that should have been a pleasant end to the day became the final chapter of the tragedy. What exactly happened in the car is known only from the testimony of Alissa's older sister, who was sitting nearby. For some reason, Christy flew into a rage. Maybe Alissa cried. Maybe she did something that angered Christy. The exact circumstances remain unclear. But what happened next is known with horrifying precision. Christy started beating Alissa right there in the car. The blows were so severe that the 16-month-old girl lost consciousness. Her head fell forward lifelessly. Her older sister watched in horror, powerless to do anything. Christy stopped the car several times to check on Alissa's condition. She ordered the older girl to lift her sister's head. When Alissa wouldn't regain consciousness, Christy started crying, realizing the situation had spiraled out of control. The older sister, sensing something terrible was happening, asked, "What's wrong with Alissa?" Christy snapped at her, "Stop asking about it." The whole time, strange gurgling sounds came from Alissa's throat, an ominous sign of neurological damage caused by severe head trauma. These sounds meant the child needed immediate medical attention. But instead of going to the hospital, Christy continued with her errands. She stopped at McDonald's, bought food, then she stopped at the video store. Only then did she drive home. When the car pulled up to the Schaffer house, it was around 8 in the evening. Alissa had been unconscious for more than 2 hours, critical time when prompt medical care could have saved her life. Christy got out of the car, took the other children into the house, and only then returned to Alissa. She later claimed that only at this moment did she realize the seriousness of the girl's condition. But this was impossible to miss. Alissa had spent the entire trip unconscious while Christy stood in line for food and picked out a movie. And even then, Christy didn't call an ambulance. Instead, she called her brother Nate, who worked as a paramedic. When Nate arrived, Alissa was cold to the touch. She had no pulse. Only after this, at 8:25 in the evening, did Christy finally dial 911. Nate performed CPR for 15 minutes until the ambulance arrived. At 8:52 in the evening, Alissa was loaded into the ambulance. 15 minutes later, she was delivered to Parkview LaGrange Hospital. When doctors saw her body, they understood this wasn't just an accident. The entire body of the girl was covered in bruises. There was a wound on her lip. The staff did everything possible for 47 minutes. They even administered Narcan, a drug used for opioid overdoses in case the child's condition was related to drug exposure. But it was too late. At 9:54 in the evening, doctors pronounced Alissa Beth Guernsey dead. She was 16 months old. 15 minutes later, the Schaffers notified the Department of Child Services about what had happened. Three hours later, the lifeless body of the girl was transferred to the St. Joseph Forensic Center in Fort Wayne. There, Dr. Scott Wagner conducted an autopsy that confirmed what Alissa's loved ones had already suspected. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, incompatible with life. But the autopsy revealed much more, a complete picture of the months the girl had spent in Christy Schaffer's care. The top of her head was covered in bruises. Similar marks were on her face and left thigh. Inside her mouth, where the gums met the lips, 2 cuts were found, one fresh, the other older. There were areas of baldness on Alissa's head. Unlike Dr. Egley, medical examiner Dr. Wagner immediately determined that the hair hadn't fallen out naturally. It had been torn out. Her left elbow was broken with displacement of the growth plate, more evidence that the child had suffered multiple injuries. Inside the skull, the examiner found bleeding in the brain. Alissa had a bilateral subdural hematoma caused by severe repeated blows. Blood analysis showed that the only drug in Alissa's system was the Narcan administered at the hospital. This finally disproved all of Christy's stories about giving the child prescribed painkillers. There were no more excuses or explanations. The medical examiner classified Alissa's death as homicide, resulting from head trauma. The voice of little Alissa fell silent forever. Her short life, which began with such hope and love, ended in unimaginable suffering. Now there was only one thing left, to seek justice for the girl whom the system had failed at every step. What should have been a straightforward case of child murder turned into a glaring example of judicial injustice. LaGrange County Prosecutor Jeffrey Weibel made a decision that many considered unusual for such cases. Instead of directly filing murder charges, he convened a grand jury. This procedural decision had far-reaching consequences. Grand jury proceedings are conducted behind closed doors. Transcripts aren't published. What evidence was presented to the jurors, or deliberately not presented, remains sealed. The process became opaque, hidden from public oversight. Despite the medical examiner's conclusion that Alissa's death was a homicide, the grand jury indicted Christy Schaffer not for murder, but for neglect of a dependent, a Class B felony. This charge implies inaction or creating dangerous conditions, not direct violence. Given the autopsy results, torn out hair, multiple fractures in different stages of healing, fatal head trauma, the charge of simple neglect seemed absurdly lenient to many observers. But the process was set in motion. In early 2011, almost 2 years after Alissa's death, Christy Schaffer entered a plea agreement. She agreed to plead guilty to neglect of a dependent. During the sentencing hearing, Christy continued to insist that she hadn't physically harmed the girl. She only acknowledged the legal side of failing in her duties as a guardian. In May 2011, Judge J. Scott Vanderbeck handed down a sentence, 10 years in prison with 6 years suspended. The actual term was 4 years. But even that wasn't the final decision. A few months after sentencing, Judge Vanderbeck reconsidered his decision. In August 2011, he ordered Christy Schaffer's release. At the time of her release, she had served exactly 77 days. 77 days for a child's life. This decision wasn't an accident. Judge Vanderbeck was well acquainted with the Schaffer family. Christy's father, Cary Sprunger, was a well-known and respected man in town, a close friend of the judge. During the court hearing, Vanderbeck even publicly acknowledged this acquaintance. Personal connections played their role in such a lenient sentence. But the story didn't end there. News that the woman responsible for a child's death had spent less than 3 months in prison sparked a wave of public outrage.
13 investigates a very disturbing case involving an Indiana toddler. How this little girl died is tragic, but what happened after her death, well, some say that's downright shocking.
A group of activists calling themselves Alissa's Army began a campaign for justice. They organized protests at the LaGrange County Courthouse, collected petitions demanding a review of the case. One petition addressed to the White House gathered more than 27,000 signatures. Activists demanded a federal investigation, disclosure of grand jury materials, and accountability for prosecutor Jeffrey Weibel and Judge Vanderbeck. The petition text was blunt. They turned the justice system into a mockery. They're all friends with Schaffer's father. The connections ran deeper than they appeared at first glance. It turned out that Kerry Sprunger wasn't just acquainted with Judge Vanderbeck. He also maintained relationships with prosecutor Jeff Weibel and Dr. John Egley. All the key figures on whom Alissa's fate depended were connected by personal and professional relationships.
Are you friends with the family? Do you know the father?
I know Christy Schaefer's father. He's a banker here in town, and I've spoken with him on occasion, but he's never been a client of mine, and I've never done any work for him.
Why was a grand jury called in this case? Why wasn't she just charged by you in the first place?
It was a very controversial case.
Prosecutor Jeff Weibel did not want to sit down for an interview, so I spoke with him outside his office.
It wasn't clear to me what the best charge would be, so I thought a grand jury would be the best remedy for that.
Although the White House declined to comment on the petition, the scale of the public reaction showed how deeply people distrusted the local judicial system. In November 2013, justice caught up with Christy Schaffer, though indirectly. She was arrested on charges of manufacturing methamphetamine. This violated the terms of her probation in Alissa's case. In April 2014, a new judge, Kevin Wallace, sentenced her to an additional 6 years in prison for violating probation terms. Alissa's biological mother, Kelly Sprunger, tried to seek justice through civil courts. She filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Christy and Matt Schaffer. She also filed a medical malpractice suit against Dr. John Egley, accusing him of failing to diagnose signs of abuse and report them to authorities, as required by Indiana law. The case against Dr. Egley reached the Indiana Court of Appeals. In August 2014, the court ruled in favor of the doctor. The logic was legally sound but morally devastating. Although Indiana has laws requiring doctors to report suspected child abuse, these laws are criminal in nature. The state can prosecute a doctor for not reporting, but a private individual, the victim or their family, cannot file a civil suit for damages. The court cited precedent establishing that the state legislature had not created a private right of action for failure to report abuse. This meant that even if it were proven that Dr. Egley saw all the signs of torture and remained silent, civil courts couldn't hold him financially responsible. The decision effectively gave medical professionals immunity from civil liability in such cases. The case against the Department of Child Services ended differently. Unlike the doctor, the state agency agreed to a settlement. DCS paid Kelly Sprunger $150,000. It was a tacit admission of failure. The state acknowledged through financial compensation that its employees had failed to protect a child who was under their official supervision. The Alissa Guernsey case exposed systemic failures at every level of child protection. Kinship care, which should have been a safe alternative, turned into a deadly trap. Doctors who saw the child more than 10 times with obvious signs of abuse didn't report it. Social workers with an active case conducted checks and recorded everything's normal. The prosecutor used a closed grand jury proceeding to file charges that didn't match the severity of the crime. A judge personally acquainted with the defendant's family handed down a sentence of 77 days. And what about Matt Schaffer? Christy's husband, who lived in the same house where the abuse was happening, who presumably saw the child's condition every day. He wasn't charged with a single count related to Alissa's death. The entire weight of legal prosecution, minimal as it was, fell exclusively on Christy. Activists from Alissa's army gave the girl a symbolic nickname, the Little Dragonfly. In many cultures, dragonflies symbolize change and new beginnings. Some believe these creatures are angels coming to the world of the living to visit their loved ones. The story of Alissa Guernsey is a reminder of our collective responsibility to protect children. The system that was supposed to safeguard her, the Department of Child Services, medical professionals, the courts, failed her at every step. This tragedy became a call to reform the child protection system, to strengthen oversight of kinship care, to close loopholes that allow doctors to remain silent about abuse. The memory of Alissa lives on in the hearts of her surviving family members, her many supporters, and perhaps in the beautiful dragonflies that carry a piece of her spirit to a world that failed to protect her. Her life lasted only 16 months, but her story must echo forever, as a warning, as a call to action, as testimony to what happens when a child protection system becomes a system that destroys them.